In the previous video, we created a component for the Fluent card control. This was a singular card that allowed us to display information for a single object. In this video, we'll look at a modified version of this where we can use a gallery in our component to display data in multiple cards from a data source. If you haven't watched the previous video, be sure to watch that before proceeding with this one, since we'll be building off of that video directly. You can see a link to that video in the top right corner. We'll start in our previous app where we created the Fluent card component. In our components, we'll select a new component, and we'll name this component Fluent Card Gallery. We'll enable Access App Scope on this new component. Inside of our component, we'll add a new vertical container, and we'll name this Container Gal Component. The X and Y position of this container should both be 0, and we'll set the width to parent.width and the height to parent.height. We'll also set the drop shadow to none. Next, we'll insert a horizontal gallery into our gallery component container. We'll name this gallery Gal Cards, and we want to change the layout of this gallery to blank. Our cards gallery should stretch to the width of the parent container, so we'll select that option and we'll set the minimum width to 10. In the Advanced tab, we'll change the focused border thickness property to 0, since we don't want an outline to show when we select one of the cards in the gallery. We'll leave the other properties in the gallery to their defaults for now, but we'll come back and change some of these later to make some of the elements dynamic. Before we add our card component to the gallery, we'll need to create some custom properties. This card gallery works a little different than the single card we looked at in the previous video, so we'll need some new properties to help with this. The first property will be called Action Buttons, and we'll set this as a data input of type table. This will work in the same way as in our single cards and provide our cards with what buttons they should display. Next, we'll add an event property called onSelect. Similar to the single card control, we'll add a record parameter for selected button. We will also add a record parameter for selected item, and this will hold the record of which item in our gallery was actually selected. This will help with taking action when a button is pressed, so we know which card the button was pressed on. Next, we'll add a property called Items. This will be a data input of type table, and this is where we'll specify what data to fill each of our cards with. We'll add 3 number data input properties for wrap count, template width, and template padding. The wrap count will tell our gallery how many rows of cards to display. I would recommend only showing 1 row of cards to keep a carousel-like experience, but this can be adjusted. The template width and the template padding will also allow us to change the width and padding between the cards depending on what screen we insert the component into. This will give us more flexibility of how you want to use the control. We'll now give these custom properties some default values. For the action buttons, we'll go to our single Fluent card component and we'll copy the action buttons value from there. For items, we'll use the forAll function to build a table of objects that match the fields our cards will need filled out. We'll say forAll, and the first argument is to specify our data source. Since this is just our template, we'll build our own table to house some items. We'll use the table function, and we'll say that this table has 5 fields for sample avatar, sample title, sample subtitle, sample preview image, and sample preview description, as well as some sample action buttons. We'll set these all as sample placeholders, so avatar will just be the default sample image. The sample title and subtitle will just be title and subtitle. Preview image will be sample image, and preview description will be our preview description text. The action buttons will point to self.actionButtons. And this is where our buttons for our toolbar control will be located in our card. We also want to add a new field for sample ID. This is what we'll need to feed our button control to know the ID of the record that we have selected, and we can use that to take action on our data if needed. We'll close our record and our table function. Next, we need to map these values from our data source to the columns that will be used in our card control. We'll open an object with curly brackets and input the basic layout of what can be filled into our cards. Now we need to fill these properties in with the records from our data source. Since this is just our template, we'll fill them in with data from the table that we created above. Avatar will be this record.sampleAvatar, title will be this record.sampleTitle, and etc. So just to recap, for our items property in our component, we'll provide a table of all of the items that we want to display as cards in our gallery, and this function will loop through each of those items and map them to the columns that the cards require to be filled out. So in this case, the output of this table shows each of our columns filled in with that one example item. Similarly, I'll just go ahead and add a second item here, and we'll call this title 2, subtitle 2, preview description 2, and we'll make the ID 2. And so you can see the output of this is each of our columns that will fill in our cards, and each row is our data from the table that we're creating. When we insert this on a screen to use in the real world, we would then replace that table with our actual table from our data source. Keep in mind that while this is not delegable, you can use delegable queries to still pull data up to your specified delegation limit in your Power App settings. Even if this were delegable, I would say there would be a huge performance impact with displaying so many cards on the screen. With the items property filled out, we'll go to our wrap count and we'll set that to 1. We'll set our template width to 300, and we'll set our padding to 12. For our onSelect custom event, we'll go back to the single version of our card to copy our switch statement from the onSelect property on that component. Since our parameters are named a little different here, we need to change our selected parameter to selected button. We still get an error for item key, so we need to do something similar to what we did with the single card and give our parameter the schema of what to expect when a button is pressed. We'll go to the left of our formula bar and navigate to the selected button parameter. Here we'll input first of self.actionButtons. And if we go back to our onSelect event, it now knows to expect a .itemKey property. So we've given this event the idea of what our buttons look like now. We also need to specify what our selected item parameter looks like. So we'll go to the left of our formula bar and select that from the dropdown. For this, we want to give it the schema of our items records. So we'll use first of self.items to do this. For our switch formula template, let's add the record ID into our notify statement for our buttons. And that way, when we add our controls eventually, this will tell us the ID of which card record we selected. And we can test that out to make sure it's working then. So now with this, our onSelect event knows what to expect when a button is pressed, and it also knows what the gallery items look like, so that when a button is pressed, we can take action on an individual gallery item. With our prep done, we can now insert our controls. We'll go to our single version of the component, we'll right-click on our component container and select Copy. We'll then select our gallery template, and we'll paste that component container into our gallery. There are going to be a lot of errors until we switch some of the formula references over to our new component. For our gallery items property, we'll input Fluent card gallery.items. Inside our gallery controls, we'll go to each of our controls and update the formula references from Fluent card to this item. In the single card version of this component, we're specifying the properties that fill in the card at the component level. But in this case, we're filling in the items of our component from our gallery items. We also have an error for the visible property of our footer toolbar, where it's referencing Fluent card.action buttons. But we'll update that in the same way by changing it to this item.action buttons. In our onSelect property of our toolbar, we also have a couple errors. We'll change the Fluent card reference to Fluent card gallery, and in the onSelect function, we need to add the selected item parameter. We'll set this to this item. That clears all of our errors, but we still have a couple things we need to do. For our component container inside of our gallery, we need to change the height property. Instead of being parent.height, we want this container to adjust to our bottom container that's located inside our main container. You remember from our last video that container bottom will always be at the bottom of our card, so it tells us how tall our card should be. We'll set the component container's height to container bottom _1.height plus the same container.y plus 8 for some extra padding. We also need to change the width property of this container to parent.templateWidth instead of parent.width. Our cards would be way too wide if we left it as parent.width. At this point, we'll also make some of our gallery properties dynamic. So we'll set our wrap count to FluentCardGallery.wrapCount, our template size to FluentCardGallery.templateWidth, and our template padding to FluentCardGallery.templatePadding. Next, we want to automatically calculate how tall our component should be. To do this, our gallery needs to change its height depending on the height of the tallest card. We can use a simple trick to make this happen. We'll insert a text control into our gallery template and we'll name it label height. This should not be inserted into our container component. In the text of this control, we'll display the height of our component container inside of our gallery, and we can see this is 294. For our gallery, we'll then disable flexible height, and we'll set the height of the gallery to the max value of that text control in our gallery. For our formula, we'll use max of gal cards dot all items, and we want the maximum of the label height dot text. This formula would look at all of our height labels and determine which one of them has the largest value. We also want to multiply this value by our wrap count in the event that if we have multiple rows of items, we expand the height to accommodate that. Finally, we'll wrap this entire formula in parenthesis, and we'll add plus 32 to the end of this. That will just give us some extra padding to see things like the scroll bar that might appear at the bottom of our gallery. With our gallery dynamically resizing now, we'll go to our component and create a new property called AutoHeight. This will be a data output of type number. We'll select our new property and set it as galcards.height. For our component's height property, we'll then set this to self.AutoHeight. Let's go insert this control on a screen now. We can see our Fluent card gallery component, and I'll just go to the items property and copy our sample item to create another record. You can see that the height of all these cards is the same, but if I add a longer description to one of them, the height of the gallery automatically expands to accommodate it. Now the value shows as 352. If I click on the new button, you can see that it notifies me that the new button was clicked, and it gives me the ID of the gallery item that I clicked on. We'll go back to our component and we'll hide our height label in our gallery. Although the height of the component is dynamic, I would suggest turning off the wrap feature for all of the text boxes inside of our card control. This will give a very uniform look across all of our cards. Next, I'll show you how to automatically adjust the width of your control. We'll add a new property called AutoWidth, and we'll set it as a data output of type number. The value of this property is going to be our gal_cards.allItemsCount divided by our wrap count, which is self.wrapCount. We want to multiply that by our template width, which is self.templateWidth. We'll add the resulting number to our item count divided by our wrap count, multiplied by our template padding. We'll also add our template padding once at the end. Whenever we're dividing our item count by our wrap count, we also need to use the roundup function to round up to the next whole number. This might be used when there's an odd number of items compared to the wrap count, where there might be a wrap count of 2 but 3 items. That creates an empty space on the second row. So we need to accommodate that by rounding up to the next whole number. So wherever we have the item count divided by the wrap count, we'll use the roundup function with the decimal places set to 0 to round up to the next whole number. And here's our finished formula. With that done, we'll go to our component's width property and we'll set it to self.AutoWidth. If we return to our screen, we can now use our component in a real-world scenario. I'll go ahead and add a new screen with the header and footer template. For the main container, we'll set the horizontal and vertical overflow to scroll. We'll go ahead and insert our Fluent card gallery in the main container. For the action buttons, we'll have 2 buttons for Edit and Share. At this point, I'll also insert a new screen using the header and form template. We're going to connect this form to our contacts table in Dataverse, and we'll just change the default mode of this to Edit. For the item property of this form, we'll set it to var selected record. This is a variable that we haven't created yet, but we'll do so in the onSelect function of our component. If we head back to our screen, we select our component, and we'll go to the onSelect action. Now we can see our switch statement template, which I'll replace with a new statement. When the Edit button is selected, we want to set that variable var selected record to the record that we look up in our contacts data source, where the contact field, which is a GUID, is equal to our selected item.id. In this case, the ID column is formatted as text, so we need to use the GUID function to convert that to a GUID. And in this case, we want to return this record. After that, we want to navigate to our screen that contains the form. If the Share button is selected, we'll simply notify that the Share button was selected for the ID equaling the selected item.id. For our items property, we'll remove our sample data table and connect this to our contacts table. We'll set the title and subtitle as full name and job title, the description as address 1, and the ID as the GUID of the record, which is just contact. In this case, I've removed the avatar and the preview image, and you can see that they dynamically adjust to accommodate the new spacing. If we play our app, you can see the cards created for each item in our contacts table, and clicking on the Edit button for one of our cards, we're taken to our form that shows the data from our data source. Clicking the Share button, we'll see that it shows the GUID of the record that we're clicking the Share button for. Now you'll notice with the width property of our component sent to AutoWidth, there's no scroll bar on the actual gallery. Instead, the scrolling is handled by the container. We'll go ahead and change our wrap count to 2, and you can see that a new row of items appears, and the gallery dynamically adjusted its height to accommodate the next row. We can also adjust our template width. We'll raise that to 400, and now we're given more space in each of the cards. Likewise, we can reduce that to 200, and now our cards are more compact. We'll just look at another use case for this. If I go back to our original screen where we had our individual cards, we could combine these cards into one with the new control. If I go to our items property and expand that, for the first item in our table, we'll actually build this card manually. For our action buttons, we can actually have a different action button for each card. So in this case, I'm referencing self.action buttons as our action button that we want to look at. But I could also go to our singular card where we have some different action buttons like open and share, and I could copy that table of action buttons into the action button field of this record. So now for this first record, the action buttons are listed here. For the second button, they're still referencing the action buttons property. Now with some more changes to that second property, you can see that there's no preview image or preview description for this second card. If I go into the items property, you can see that the avatar is referencing our picture of a baseball. And for the action buttons, now we only have this singular schedule action, but there's no property for the description or the image. Because those properties are blank, the height of the card has automatically adjusted itself. There is currently a bug as of recording this video where parameters inside of a component do not update when pointed to a data source. They only reference the original data source specified in the original copy of the component. To see what I mean, we'll go to our items property for this component inserted on our screen. In the section of our for all formula, where each of the properties of the cards are mapped to a column from our data source, we'll go ahead and add a new field for toScreen. And we'll set this to screen 2. The intention for this field would be for the card to communicate to our onSelect function which screen we should move to based on the card that we've selected. If we go back to our onSelect function, and we'll just change this first notify function to navigate, and we want to navigate to the selected item dot toScreen. But as you can see from the IntelliSense suggestions, there's no toScreen listed here. So the parameter in our component didn't update to grab the new schema of what our selected item record looks like. To fix this, we do have to go to our actual component, and we'll go to our items property here. We can enter in toScreen as a new field here, and we'll set it to screen 1. Now if we return to our app, we can look in the items property here, and we do see toScreen listed as a property with screen 1. If we go to our advanced tab and we go to the onSelect function, we no longer have an error for toScreen. So it's able to see that new property that we added to the items page. Since the point of the component is to be reusable without having to modify the original component, you could add any number of different fields to the original component items property. And whether you actually use them when you've added the component to the screen is up to you. So in this case, you could leave that as blank, or you could just remove toScreen entirely if you're not going to use it in this instance of the card gallery. I'll just show one final example here. So we have a welcome screen that has one of our new controls in it. So this items property is being filled in with a tips and tricks SharePoint list that we have. So if you look at this SharePoint list, you can see we have a title, we have a category of our tip that we're trying to display, we have a logo, a banner, and a description. So in our Power app, we've associated each of those columns with an associated column in our card control. Currently, our Action Buttons property only has one action for view, but you could also remove the Action Button table entirely, and the whole thing will kind of reflow to adjust itself to not having the action buttons present. And that's about it. Let me know your thoughts on today's video and the approach that I took in creating this component. There are a couple different ways to go about creating something like this, but I think this method offered the most flexibility in terms of the gallery settings and the layout when the component was inserted on a screen. I hope you picked up some useful tips from the work that we did on creating an automatic height and automatic width component. But let me know if you have any ideas on approaches that you think I should have taken in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching and thank you for your support.